Very special thanks to Cardiff Trade Sales for providing the vehicle in this review. Of course, if you're on the market for something like this specifically, then by all means give their website a look down below. But even if you're looking for something that's maybe not as performance-oriented, something more like a daily driver, like a hatchback or a sedan, then they have plenty of those as well. So check out their stock, and of course if you're in or near the Cardiff area, then may be able to find what you're looking for. The Audi RS4 is basically one of the most iconic performance cars of the 2000s. Certainly one of the most iconic super saloons if you want to get more specific about it, but a fascinating thing about this exact version of the RS4, which incidentally is the B8 generation, produced from 2012 to 2015, is that in a funny kind of way it actually goes back to Audi's roots when it comes to the RS4 and even the predecessor to the RS4, which is of course the iconic and super rare RS2. Now the thing that it has in common with those, especially the RS2 but even the 2001 shape RS4 with that 2.7 litre bi-turbo engine, is that this generation is only sold as a wagon, or an Avant as Audi likes to call them. That's a very risky move to make, especially when, unlike the RS2 and the first RS4, there has now been a precedent for a sedan to be included, because of course the B7 generation is a massively popular RS4 sedan, and they even made a convertible version of that car as well. Now that one is more affordable than this particular model used, because of course it's slower, less powerful, older. That one, for instance, was more of a manual experience. This one has an auto with flappy paddles, so it really depends on what you want and what you need from the car. In terms of updates and potential comparisons that you could make between this one and the older generation RS4s, maybe even some of the newer ones, there's a lot to like here. Now, the fact that it's only available as a wagon might put some people off. For me, I think that's a pretty bold move. As I said, it definitely harkens back to those roots with the RS2 and the 2.7 litre RS4, and I actually love that. In fact, if you could only have one, I would probably say make it a wagon, because it's just such a brilliant all-round vehicle. I have a lot of time for high-performance wagons, or estates as we typically call them in the UK, and of course high-performance SUVs as well, because they're just so versatile. You can do so much with a car like this. But, of course, most people who are looking for an RS4, or maybe one of its rivals from Mercedes-AMG or BMW, for example, you're probably not going to look at practicality first. Chances are you're looking at performance first things first, otherwise you'd have just bought a normal A4 wagon. So what is the performance like? Well, the engine, in a similar way to the B7, is still a 4.2 litre naturally aspirated V8. Power and torque are up on this car though compared to the previous generation, as you'd hope and assume of course, and it actually mates quite well with that updated gearbox, which is one of the major differences that this one has to that previous car. We'll talk about that more in just a second. In terms of power though, the previous car has about 414 horses, this one's got 444, nice number to be working with, not a huge difference. But we'll get to the power delivery in a second as well, because it's pretty impressive on this car. In terms of torque, well, naturally aspirated V8s don't tend to be the torquiest thing around. Audi also doesn't tend to go for that anyway, so the torque is modest, about 317 pound-feet. So overall, the kind of engine note and the responsiveness and almost the tone of its performance almost reminds me of something more like an Italian engine, like a Maserati or a Ferrari, where it's got higher end power, not so much torque, and a lot of nice noises. Unlike a lot of those Italian cars though, it's actually pretty reliable, and it's well engineered to begin with, which of course Italy kind of falls short on in a lot of ways, whereas Germany, not so much. Not to say that they can't brake, but they do tend to be more reliable overall. Now in terms of performance, it's not necessarily a massive step up from that B7. 0 to 60 is still claimed to be 4.7 seconds. It wouldn't surprise me if you get it to be a little bit lower than that in practice though. Germans do tend to undersell their cars a little bit. Porsche's actually kind of notorious for doing that. Top speed of course is limited to 155. Which is a shame. I mean, come on, just unlimit the car, show us what it can really do. A lot of owners will probably do that anyway, so you might as well offer it as a package, but 155 is the stock top speed. In terms of fuel economy, well, again, a lot of people probably won't care as much, but for those who do, such as myself, the economy figures on this RS4 do vary quite a bit. The around town mileage is quoted at 19 miles per gallon. I actually found that to be very accurate in the time that I drove the car. In fact, I averaged about 20 in the city, so that is pretty good. It's pretty close to what they say. On the motorway, or the highway, for our American friends, you're looking at about 33 miles per gallon. And again, that is UK miles per gallon, which is different to the US. And the overall average miles per gallon is quoted at about 26. So in my case, it was definitely lower than that. But of course, I did more city driving than open, 65, 70 mile an hour highway stuff. Overall though, for a car of its type, and again you've got to bear in mind a naturally aspirated V8 car of its type, which again isn't exactly going to be the most efficient thing around, turbos and superchargers do a world of improvement to fuel economy, contrary to what many people would probably assume. This car doesn't have that advantage. So for what it is, I think the fuel economy is actually pretty good. Now in terms of practicality, the space actually really impressed me, because the A4 isn't that big of a car. I've been in A6s before. The A8 of course is going to be a large vehicle. The A4 is kind of, intended to be the smallest sedan of the range, conventionally speaking, and I've been in stuff like Mercedes C-classes before, etc., and sometimes I wasn't that impressed by the headroom, the legroom, or usually the width. In the case of this car though, it's actually very good. The headroom was great, the seating position was really good. If anything, I might have liked the seat to be positioned a little bit lower in the car in terms of how low the seat can move. But again, it didn't stop me from enjoying the car by any stretch. In terms of stuff, just for a moment, that I don't like as much about the interior, of course I love the space. My favourite thing about it is the steering wheel, which sounds like an incidental thing, but as I've said in my other car reviews, to me personally, interior design and ergonomics and usability are hugely important, because at the end of the day, real life is not a video game. You don't drive the car from third-person view, you're sitting inside it all the time, so it needs to be a nice place to be. And that is where I've sometimes taken issue, not just with Audi, but with some Beamers, even some Mercs, especially in the Chrysler era of the earlier 2000s, where I'm just not a huge fan of those German interiors. They kind of look a little bit too much like an office for my taste, a little bit boring, not enough flair. In terms of this Audi, the steering wheel and the gear shifter are my two favourite looking things, and ergonomically speaking, they feel cool to use. The rest of the interior, it's just an Audi A4. So yes, it's an RS4, but they didn't put a huge amount of flair into the rest of it, so that will be a critique from me in that regard. I do love that steering wheel though, which, as I said, sounds like a trivial thing, but it feels great. It's a little bit smaller than you'd expect, which makes the car feel more playful, makes the car feel a little bit more like a hot hatch even, which defies its size and especially length. And of course, that switch in transmission will be one of the most controversial things about the car for previous B7 fans. I still love the B7. It might even be one of my favourite versions of the RS4. But I think that having this one just makes more sense in the modern age. You've got the flappy paddles, which are quicker than a clutch. You've got the automatic for lazy driving, which of course I'm going to be a fan of. That could be controversial for some people. If the manual is essential for you, then I would probably recommend sticking to the previous B7 generation. This one though, I think benefits from that new gearbox. Now to go back for just a second to the way this car handles, I mentioned for instance it feels kind of like an extended hot hatch in some ways, which I think is fantastic. The playful nature of the car is easily one of the biggest selling points. And that is something which is definitely carried over from previous RS4s, and even other RS models, RS3, RS6, whatever the case may be. They're known for being really good, fun drivers' cars. BMW and Mercedes-AMG offer a lot of great rivals in that regard, and there are even some less conventional ones like the Lexus ISF in that same kind of ballpark, or a Cadillac CT-SV. This one though has tons of practicality. And the fact that it is only available as a wagon really does set it apart from a lot of those rivals. For instance, there is no Lexus ISF wagon. The BMW M3 isn't exactly available as a wagon in most of its forms either, unless you make one yourself. But for a vehicle with this much space, based on a platform which for the most part is designed to be a pretty sensible daily driver, the A4, it's remarkably fun. And one of the main reasons why is the sound as well. And that brings me to the next point. This thing sounds fantastic. In fact, sometimes it almost sounded like it had a twin turbo. And I think that was probably just intake noise more than anything else, but it's got a lovely exhaust tone, as you'll hear a few times in the background of the video, especially when you really floor it, of course. It's got a lovely bark to the engine. And funnily enough, it's got a very similar engine spec to my Maserati, a 4.2 naturally aspirated V8, but a very different sound that the two cars make. Another hugely significant difference between this B8 generation and the previous B7, in fact most of Audi's performance cars before this, is the torque split. That is a very significant thing to bear in mind because Audi is very well known, even as far back as the original TT Quattros, for having a 50-50 split between the front and rear wheels. It gives you a huge amount of grip, but sometimes it can hinder the fun factor a little bit. It makes the car sometimes feel a little bit too safe, according to some reviewers and owners. As far as this car though, they actually changed that to a 40-60, with the more bias toward the rear, and although it's not necessarily a drift machine, it does definitely have a slightly lighter front end and a meatier back end, which makes it feel that much more fun compared to what a 50-50 would feel like. And even though you might think, well, surely having 10% less on the front is a bad thing, less control, less grip, less power going to those front wheels to pull you through corners, well yes, you could argue back and forth on that all day, and I'm sure there are entire forums dedicated to doing just that, but I will say that having more of a playful nature does not sacrifice the safety and the feeling of focus that the car has. Yes, it's playful, in fact it feels like it wants to play all the time, but there's so much grip from the Quattro system that sacrificing a little bit to the back end really doesn't make that much of a difference to the amount of grip that the front end still has. Now, in terms of pricing and value and used car markets, if you will, what kind of price should you expect to pay? Well, of course, most of the prices that I quote tend to be in the UK, so this will vary a lot. In Europe, for instance, or in America, prices go up and down depending on import costs, taxes, etc. But here in the UK, this particular generation, you're looking at about £27,000–28,000 at the time of releasing this video. This one, for instance, is 28 grand or a fraction under, and that's about what you should be expecting to pay. So yes, of course it is more expensive used than the previous generation, as you would assume, but at the same time that's a lot of car for the money, and for a vehicle which is only around 2012 to 2015, it's not even that old. It still feels very good. In fact, it feels like it could easily pass as a 2017, 2018 car, because the way it feels, the way it looks, has aged very well, I think. Overall, I would say that this car has a couple of really strong positive points which will single out the exact kind of buyer who should get one. If you're looking for a sedan or a wagon in this case, which is high performance but kind of sedate most of the time, then it might not be the car for you. Because although it can be sedate, you can tell that the car doesn't really want to be. It acquiesces to driving around town sensibly, but it wants to play. It really does. It's like an excitable puppy in that regard. It has loads of noise, loads of performance, brutal acceleration and great handling, and it wants you to use that. So if you are looking for that more restrained experience but with performance as well, well then maybe something like a Mercedes or perhaps a Jaguar might be more your thing. If though cars like the RS4 or the BMW M3 appeal to you, maybe that Lexus ISF as well, then definitely consider this one. The fact that it's only a wagon might put some people off, but I would actually tell you, don't let it put you off. Test drive one if you can, see what you think of it, and having that extra trunk space certainly isn't a disadvantage. I think most of the people who don't tend to like wagons as much is usually for the visual side of things. So if you're looking for a pretty good looking, great sounding, really nice handling, very high performance wagon which has tons of space, in fact great ergonomics on a daily basis because the car itself isn't overly large, then absolutely try and check one out if you can. And one of the best pieces of praise that I can give this car is actually that it feels a lot less German than you'd expect. German cars are known for being over-engineered in a good way, pretty reliable and very fast and powerful, but not necessarily the most charismatic or playful things around. This goes to show that they really can be, and you don't just have to buy something like a Porsche to prove that. Audi, I think, has done a great job with this. Of course, they've had plenty of previous experience in the RS models to do so, and it shows. It's a very well-rounded car. I like it quite a bit. The sound is great, the look is good, handling is great, of course the performance is great. So the only slight downsides for some people may be the fact that you can't get a sedan or convertible version, and potentially more so the daily fuel economy, which of course is going to be thirsty because it's a performance car. If those two things don't bother you, then absolutely try to check one out if you can. But overall, that's it for this review. Of course, if you want to check out my other high performance reviews, click the playlist on screen, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.